Chapter 68 of the Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kathleen. The Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud by Jenkins OLCOTT. Butterfly's Diamond. Once upon a time there was a little fairy who was remarkable for her impatience and laziness. She was called Fairy Butterfly because she had such splendid green wings with silver spots on them. She loved dearly to be dressed in gorgeous colors, and to sleep in the rich chambers of the foxgloves, or to flutter over beds of fragrant mignonette. In truth, she was as luxurious a little fairy as the sun ever shone on. So much did she like her ease that she would not gather a single dewdrop to bathe her face, nor would she pick a fresh rose petal for a napkin. She played all day long, or slept curled up in the heart of a flower. Oh, she was a lazy fairy. When the Queen of the Fairies observed the faults of Butterfly, she resolved to help her to correct them. One day she summoned the lazy one to court, and said, "Fairy Butterfly, we command you to go at once to the green cavern in the island of Ceylon, and remain there until you have fashioned a diamond more pure and brilliant than any that has ever rested on the brow of mortal or elf." Little Butterfly bowed in silence and withdrew. As soon as she was outside the green mound in which the Fairy Queen held her court, she burst into a passionate flood of tears. "I shall have to watch that diamond for months and months and years," sobbed she, "and every day I must turn it over with my wand so that the crystals will form evenly. Oh, it is an endless labor to make a diamond! Oh, I am a most wretched fairy." So she sat and sobbed and murmured for several minutes. Then she jumped up and stamped her little feet on the ground so furiously that the blue-eyed grasses trembled. "I won't bear it!" she exclaimed. "I'll run away to the fairies of the air. I am sure they will be so pleased with my beauty that they will feed me, and I shall never need to work again. As for the diamond, why, it is just impossible for a little fairy like me to make it." Then she peeped into a fountain to admire herself, and saw, alas, that the splendid green of her wings had faded, and the silver spots were dim. For, if fairies have naughty thoughts, their wings always droop and their beauty fades. At this sight, little Butterfly wept aloud with vexation and shame. "I suppose the old tyrant, our Queen, thinks that now I am so ugly, I'll hide myself in the green cavern in the island of Ceylon. But I'll let her see that I do not care about her." And, alas! As Butterfly spoke thus, the silver spots disappeared entirely, and her wings became a dirty brown. Trembling with anger, the little one waved her wand, and called, "Hummingbird, hummingbird, come nigh, and carry me off to the far blue sky." In an instant a tiny hummingbird, shining like a jewel, alighted at her feet. She sprang on its back, and away they flew to the golden clouds in the west, where the Queen of the Air Fairies held her court. And when the Queen and all her fairies saw Butterfly's dirty brown wings, they waved their wands and vanished, and little Butterfly was left alone in the palace of the air. But such a beautiful palace as it was! The clouds hung around it like transparent curtains of opal. The floor was paved with a rainbow. Thousands of gorgeous birds fluttered in the sunlight, and a multitude of voices filled the place with sweet sounds. Butterfly, fatigued by her flight through the sky and lulled by the voices, lay down on a rosy cloud, and fell into a gentle slumber. When she awoke, she saw that a tiny bird, smaller than the hummingbird, was building a nest beside her. Straw after straw, shred after shred, the patient little creature brought in her bill and wove together, and then she flew away over hills and fields to find soft down with which to line the nest. "She is a foolish thing," murmured Butterfly. "How hard she works, and I don't believe that she will finish it after all." But soon the bird came back with her bill full of down, and lined the soft warm nest so that it was fit for a fairy to sleep in. Butterfly peeked into it, and exclaimed, "Oh, what a pretty thing!" Immediately she heard the tinkling of a lute, and a clear voice singing, "Bit by bit the bird builds her nest." She started up, and the Queen of the Air Fairies stood before her, clad in a robe of azure gossamer, embroidered with rainbow lights. "Foolish Butterfly," said she, "we allow no idlers here. Obey your Queen, and go at once to the Green Cavern in the island of Ceylon. Time and patience will accomplish all things. Go and make your diamond, and then you shall be welcome here." Butterfly tried to tell her how very hard it was to make a diamond, but the Queen of the Air Fairies flew away, touching her lute, and singing, "Bit by bit the bird builds her nest." Butterfly leaned her head upon her hands for a minute. She began to be ashamed of being so lazy, but she did not yet wish to go to the lonely Green Cavern and work hard. So she waved her wand, and called again, "Hummingbird, hummingbird, come nigh, and carry me back through the clear blue sky." Immediately the little hummingbird returned, and she sprang on his back. He flew down with her, and she alighted near the green mound inside of which the Fairy Queen held her court. Close by the mound Butterfly saw some bees working in a crystal hive. Wearily and sadly she watched them. They left the hive, dipped into flowers, and carried their loads of sweet pollen back to the hive, and there they built their wax combs filled with golden honey. "I wish," thought she, "that I loved to work as hard as the bees do. But as for that diamond, it is useless to think about it. I should never finish it." Just then she heard strains of delightful music coming from the mound, and a chorus of fairy voices singing, "Little by little the bee builds its cell." Butterfly could have wept when she heard those familiar voices, for she longed to be with her fairy sisters dancing hand in hand. "I will make the diamond," murmured she. "I shall surely get it done some time, and I can fly home every night and dance in the fairy ring, or sleep in the flowers." Immediately a joyful strain of music rose on the air, and she heard her sisters' voices singing, "To the Green Cavern haste away, sleep by night and work by day. Little by little the gem will grow, till pure as sunshine it will glow." Alas! When Butterfly heard this, instead of flying at once to the Green Cavern, she began to think how hard she should have to work, and how many times she must turn the diamond. "I never can do it," thought she. "I will go to the Queen of the Ocean Fairies. I am sure she will let me live in her sea palace, and I need never work again." Mournful notes came from the mound, as Butterfly turned toward the seashore. When she reached the beach, she waved her wand, and called, "Nautilus, Nautilus, come to me and carry me through the cold green sea." Immediately the delicate pearly boat of the Nautilus came floating over the ocean, and a wave landed it at Butterfly's feet. She stepped in, and down, down under the waves she went, down to the bed of the ocean, to a coral grove. And there was the magnificent palace of the Queen of the Ocean Fairies. Its pink coral pillars were twisted into 1,000 beautiful forms. Pearls hung in deep festoons from the arches. The fan coral and the sea moss were formed into deep, cool bowers, and the hard, sandy floor was covered with many-colored shells. But as it had been in the air, so it was in the sea. When the Queen of the Ocean Fairies saw Butterfly's dirty brown wings, she and all her court waved their wands and disappeared, and Butterfly was left alone in the sea palace. "How beautiful it is!" cried she. "Giants must have made these coral pillars." As she spoke her eyes were nearly blinded by a swarm of tiny insects, and she saw them rest on an unfinished coral pillar. While she looked and wondered, she heard 1,000 shell trumpets being blown, and many voices singing, "Mite by mite the insect builds the coral bower." The sounds drew nearer and nearer, and 100 fairies, standing in beautiful shells, came floating through the water. In the largest shell of all was their queen in a robe of wave-colored silk spun by the ocean silkworm. It was as thin as a spider's web, and the border was gracefully wrought with seed pearls. "Foolish butterfly," said the Queen, "learn to be industrious. We allow no idlers at our court. Look at the coral pillars of my palace. They were made by these swarms of little creatures. Labor and patience did it all." And she waved her wand, and the 100 shells floated away, while all the fairies sang, "Mite by mite the insect builds the coral bower." "Well," said Butterfly, sighing, "all creatures are busy. On the earth, in the air, and under the water, all things seem happy at their work. Perhaps I can learn to be so, too. I will make the diamond, and it shall be as pure and brilliant as a sunbeam in a water drop." So Butterfly sought the green cavern in the island of Ceylon. Day by day she worked as busily as the coral insects. She grew cheerful and happy. Her wings once more became a splendid green, and the silver spots were so bright that they seemed like sparks of fire. Never had she been so beautiful, never so much loved by the little birds and flowers. After 7 years had passed by, Butterfly knelt at the feet of her queen and offered her diamond. It gave light like a star, and the whole fairy mound shone with its rays, and to this day the fairies call it Butterfly's Diamond. Lydia Marie Childe adapted. End of chapter 68.
Chapter 69 of the Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by marystufflebeam. The Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud by Jenkins OLCOTT. Little Niebla. Have you seen the white mist over the river Yí in the morning? A light white mist that flies away when the sun gets hot? Yes? Then I will tell you a story about the white mist and a little girl named Alma. Little Alma lived close to the river Yí, but far, far from here. Beyond the trees and beyond the blue hills, for the Yí is a very long river. She lived with her grandmother and with 6 uncles, all big, tall men with long beards, and they always talked about wars and cattle and a great many other important things that Alma could not understand. There was no one to talk to Alma, and for Alma to talk to or play with. And when she went out of the house where all the big people were talking, she heard the cocks crowing, the dogs barking, the birds singing, the sheep bleating, and the trees rustling their leaves over her head. And she could not understand one word of all they said. At last, having no one to play with or talk to, she sat down and began to cry. Now, it happened that near the spot where she sat there was an old black woman wearing a red shawl, who was gathering sticks for the fire, and she asked Alma why she cried. "Because I have no one to talk to or play with," said Alma. Then the old black woman drew a long brass pin out of her shawl, and pricked Alma's tongue with it, for she made Alma hold it out to be pricked. "Now," said the old woman, "you can go and play and talk with the dogs, cats, birds, and trees, for you will understand all they say, and they will understand all you say." Alma was very glad, and ran home as fast as she could to talk to the cat. "Come, cat, let us talk and play together," she said. "Oh, no," said the cat. "I am very busy watching a little bird, so you must go away and play with little Niebla down by the river." Then the cat ran away among the weeds and left her. The dogs also refused to play when she went to them, for they had to watch the house and bark at strangers. Then they also told her to go and play with little Niebla down by the river. Then Alma ran out and caught a little duckling, a soft little thing that looked like a ball of yellow cotton, and said, "Now, little duck, let us talk and play." But the duckling only struggled to get away, and screamed, "Oh, Mama, Mama, come and take me away from Alma." Then the old duck came rushing up and said, "Alma, let my child alone, and if you want to play, go and play with Niebla down by the river. A nice thing to catch my ducky in your hands. What next, I wonder?" So she let the duckling go, and at last said, "Yes, I will go and play with Niebla down by the river." She waited till she saw the white mist, and then ran all the way to the Yi, and stood still on the green bank close by the water with the white mist all round her. By and by she saw a beautiful little child come flying toward her in the white mist. The child came and stood on the green bank and looked at Alma. Very, very pretty she was, and she wore a white dress, whiter than milk, whiter than foam, and all embroidered with purple flowers. She had also white silk stockings and scarlet shoes, bright as scarlet verbenas. Her hair was long and fluffy and shone like gold, and round her neck she had a string of big gold beads. Then Alma said, "Oh, beautiful little girl, what is your name?" To which the little girl answered, "Niebla." "Will you talk to me and play with me?" said Alma. "Oh, no," said Niebla. "How can I play with a little girl dressed as you are, and with bare feet?" For you know, poor Alma only wore a little old frock that came down to her knees, and she had no shoes and stockings on. Then little Niebla rose up and floated away from the bank and down the river, and at last, when she was quite out of sight in the white mist, Alma began to cry. When it got very hot, she went and sat down, still crying, under the trees. There were 2 very big willow trees growing near the river. By and by, the leaves rustled in the wind, and the trees began talking to each other, and Alma understood everything they said. "Have you got any nests in your branches?" said one tree. "Yes, one," said the other tree. "It was made by a little yellow bird, and there are 5 speckled eggs in it." Then the first tree said, "There is a little Alma sitting in our shade. Do you know why she is crying, neighbor?" The other tree answered, "Yes, it is because she has no one to play with. Little Niebla by the river refused to play with her because she is not beautifully dressed." Then the first tree said, "Ah, she ought to go and ask the fox for some pretty clothes to wear. The fox always keeps a great store of pretty things in her hole." Alma had listened to every word of this conversation. She remembered that a fox lived on the hillside not far off, for she had often seen it sitting in the sunshine, with its little ones playing round it and pulling their mother's tail in fun. So Alma got up and ran till she found the hole, and putting her head down it, she cried out, "Fox, fox!" But the fox seemed cross, and only answered without coming out, "Go away, Alma, and talk to little Niebla. I am busy getting dinner for my children, and have no time to talk to you now." Then Alma cried, "Oh, fox, Niebla will not play with me because I have no pretty things to wear. Oh, fox, will you give me a nice dress, and shoes, and stockings, and a string of beads?" After a while, the fox came out of its hole with a big bundle done up in a red cotton handkerchief, and said, "Here are the things, Alma, and I hope they will fit you. But you know, Alma, you really ought not to come at this time of day, for I am very busy just now cooking the dinner, an armadillo roasted and a couple of partridges stewed with rice, and a little omelet of turkey's eggs. I mean, plover's eggs, of course. I never touch turkey's eggs." Alma said she was very sorry to give so much trouble. "Oh, never mind," said the fox. "How is your grandmother?" "She is very well, thank you," said Alma, "but she has a bad headache." "I am very sorry to hear it," said the fox. "Tell her to stick 2 fresh stock leaves on her temples, and on no account to go out in the hot sun. Give her my best respects. And now, run home, Alma, and try on the things, and when you are passing this way, you can bring me back the handkerchief, as I always tie my face up in it when I have the toothache." Alma thanked the fox very much, and ran home as fast as she could. And when the bundle was opened, she found in it a beautiful white dress, embroidered with purple flowers, a pair of scarlet shoes, silk stockings, and a string of great golden beads. They all fitted her very well, and next day, when the white mist was on the Yi, she dressed herself in her beautiful clothes and went down to the river. By and by, little Niebla came flying along, and when she saw Alma, she came and kissed her, and took her by the hand. All the morning they played and talked together, gathering flowers and running races over the green sward. And at last, Niebla bade her good-bye, and flew away, for all the white mist was floating off down the river. But every day after that, Alma found her little companion by the Yi, and was very happy, for now she had someone to talk to and play with. End of chapter. Recording by marystufflebeam.
Chapter number 70 of the Book of Elves and Fairies for storytelling and reading out loud. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. The Book of Elves and Fairies for storytelling and reading out loud. By Frances Jenkins OLCOTT. Little Tiny. There was once a woman who wished very much to have a little child. So she went to a fairy and said, "I should so very much like to have a little child. Can you tell me where I may find one?" "Oh, that is easily managed," said the fairy. "Here is a barley corn of a different kind to those which grow in the farmers' fields, and which the chickens eat. Put it in a flower pot, and see what will happen." "Thank you," said the woman, and she gave the fairy 12 shillings, which was the price of the barley corn. Then she went home and planted it, and immediately there grew up a large handsome flower, something like a tulip in appearance, but with its leaves tightly closed as if it was still a bud. "It is a beautiful flower," said the woman, and she kissed the red and golden covered leaves, and while she did so the flower opened, and she could see that it was a real tulip. Within the flower, upon the green velvet stamens, sat a very delicate and graceful little maiden. She was scarcely half as long as a thumb, and they gave her the name of Little Thumb, or Tiny, because she was so small. A walnut shell, elegantly polished, served her for a cradle. Her bed was formed of blue violet leaves, with a rose leaf for a counterpane. Here she slept at night, but during the day she amused herself on a table, where the woman had placed a plateful of water. Round this plate were wreaths of flowers with their stems in the water, and upon it floated a large tulip leaf, which served Tiny for a boat. Here the little maiden sat and rowed herself from side to side, with 2 oars made of white horse hair. It really was a very pretty sight. Tiny could, also, sing so softly and sweetly that nothing like her singing had ever before been heard. One night, while she lay in her pretty bed, a large, ugly, wet toad crept through a broken pane of glass in the window, and leaped right up on the table where Tiny lay sleeping under her rose leaf quilt. "What a pretty little wife this would make for my son," said the toad, and she took up the walnut shell in which little Tiny lay asleep, and jumped through the window with it into the garden. In the swampy margin of a broad stream in the garden lived the toad, with her son. He was uglier even than his mother, and when he saw the pretty little maiden in her elegant bed, he could only cry, "Croak, croak, croak." "Don't speak so loud, or she will wake," said the toad, "and then she might run away, for she is as light as swan's down. We will place her on one of the water lily leaves out in the stream. It will be like an island to her, she is so light and small, and then she cannot escape. And, while she is away, we will make haste and prepare the stateroom under the marsh, in which you are to live when you are married." Far out in the stream grew a number of water lilies, with broad green leaves, which seemed to float on top of the water. The largest of these leaves appeared farther off than the rest, and the old toad swam out to it with the walnut shell, in which little Tiny lay still asleep. The little creature woke very early in the morning, and began to cry bitterly when she found where she was, for she could see nothing but water on every side of the large green leaf, and no way of reaching the land. Meanwhile, the old toad was very busy under the marsh, decking her room with rushes and wild yellow flowers, to make it look pretty for her new daughter in law. Then she swam out with her ugly son to the leaf which she had placed poor little Tiny. She wanted to fetch the pretty bed, that she might put it in the bridal chamber to be ready for her. The old toad bowed low to her in the water, and said: "Here is my son. He will be your husband, and you will live happily together in the marsh by the stream." "Croak, croak, croak," was all her son could say for himself. So the toad took up the elegant little bed, and swam away with it, leaving Tiny all alone on the green leaf, where she sat and wept. She could not bear to think of living with the old toad, and having her ugly son for a husband. The little fishes, who swam about in the water, had seen the toad, and heard what she said, so they lifted their heads above the water to look at the little maiden. As soon as they caught sight of her, they saw she was very pretty, and it made them sorry to think that she must go and live with the ugly toads. No, it must never be! So they assembled together in the water round the green stalk, which held the leaf on which the little maiden stood, and gnawed it away at the root with their teeth. Then the leaf floated down the stream, carrying Tiny far away. Tiny sailed past many towns, and the little birds in the bushes saw her and sang, "What a lovely little creature!" So the leaf swam away with her farther and farther, till it brought her to other lands. A graceful little white butterfly constantly fluttered round her, and at last alighted on the leaf. Tiny pleased him, and she was glad of it, for now the toad could not possibly reach her, and the country through which she sailed was beautiful, and the sun shone upon the water till it glittered like liquid gold. She took off her girdle and tied one end of it round the butterfly, and the other end of the ribbon she fastened to the leaf, which now glided on much faster than ever, taking little Tiny with it as she stood. Presently a large cockchafer flew by. The moment he caught sight of her, he seized her round her delicate waist with his claws, and flew with her into a tree. The green leaf floated away on the brook, and the butterfly flew with it, for he was fastened to it, and could not get away. Oh, how frightened little Tiny felt when the cockchafer flew with her to the tree! But especially she was sorry for the beautiful white butterfly which she had fastened to the leaf, for if he could not free himself he would die of hunger. But the cockchafer did not trouble himself at all about the matter. He seated himself by her side on the large green leaf, and gave her some honey from the flowers to eat, and told her she was very pretty, though not in the least like a cockchafer. After a time all the cockchafers who lived in the tree came to visit her. They stared at Tiny, and then the young lady cockchafers turned up their feelers, and said, "She has only 2 legs. How ugly that looks!" "She has no feelers," said another. "Her waist is quite slim. Pooh! She is like a human being." "Oh, she is ugly," said all the lady cockchafers, although Tiny was very pretty. Thus the cockchafer who had run away with her believed all the others when they said she was ugly, and would have nothing more to say to her, and told her she might go where she liked. Then he flew down with her from the tree, and placed her on a daisy, and she wept at the thought that she was so ugly that even the cockchafers would have nothing to say to her. And all the while she was really the loveliest creature that one could imagine, and as tender and delicate as a beautiful rose leaf. During the whole summer poor little Tiny lived quite alone in the wide forest. She wove herself a bed with blades of grass, and hung it up under a broad leaf, to protect herself from the rain. She sucked the honey from the flowers for food, and drank the dew from their leaves every morning. So passed away the summer and the autumn, and then came the winter, the long, cold winter. All the birds who had sung to her so sweetly were flown away, and the trees and flowers had withered. The large clover leaf, under the shelter of which she had lived, was now rolled together and shriveled up. Nothing remained but a yellow withered stalk. She felt dreadfully cold, for her clothes were torn, and she was herself so frail and delicate that, poor little thing, she was nearly frozen to death. It began to snow, too, and the snowflakes, as they fell upon her, were like a whole shovelful falling upon one of us, for we are tall, but she was only an inch high. Then she wrapped herself up in a dry leaf, but it cracked in the middle and could not keep her warm, and she shivered with cold. Near the wood in which she had been living lay a large cornfield, but the corn had been cut a long time. Nothing remained but the bare, dry stubble standing up out of the frozen ground. It was to her like struggling through a large wood. Oh, how she shivered with the cold! She came at last to the door of a field mouse, who had a little den under the corn stubble. There dwelt the field mouse in warmth and comfort, with a whole roomful of corn, a kitchen, and a beautiful dining room. Poor little Tiny stood before the door, just like a little beggar girl, and begged for a small piece of barley corn, for she had been without a morsel to eat for 2 days. "You poor little creature," said the field mouse, who was really a good old field mouse, "come into my warm room and dine with me." She was very pleased with Tiny, so she said, "You are quite welcome to stay with me all the winter, if you like, but you must keep my rooms clean and neat, and tell me stories, for I shall like to hear them very much." And Tiny did all the field mouse asked of her, and found herself very comfortable. "We shall have a visitor soon," said the field mouse one day. "My neighbor pays me a visit once a week. He is better off than I am. He has large rooms, and wears a beautiful black velvet coat. If you could only have him for a husband, you would be well provided for indeed. But he is blind, so you must tell him some of your prettiest stories." But Tiny did not feel at all interested about this neighbor, for he was a mole. However, he came and paid his visit, dressed in his black velvet coat. "He is very rich and learned, and his house is 20 times larger than mine," said the field mouse. He was rich and learned, no doubt, but he always spoke slightingly of the sun and the pretty flowers, because he had never seen them. Tiny was obliged to sing to him, Lady Bird, fly away home," and many other pretty songs, and the mole fell in love with her, because she had such a sweet voice. But he said nothing yet, for he was very cautious. A short time before, the mole had dug a long passage under the earth, which led from the dwelling of the field mouse to his own, and here she had permission to walk with Tiny whenever she liked. but he warned them not to be alarmed at the sight of a dead bird which lay in the passage. It was a perfect bird, with a beak and feathers, and could not have been dead long, and was lying just where the mole had made his passage. The mole took a piece of phosphorescent wood in his mouth, and it glittered like fire in the dark. Then he went before them to light them through the long, dark passage. When they came to the spot where lay the dead bird, the mole pushed his broad nose through the ceiling. The earth gave way, so that there was a large hole, and the daylight shone into the passage. In the middle of the floor lay the dead swallow, his beautiful wings pulled close to his sides, his feet and his head drawn up under his feathers. The poor bird had evidently died of the cold. It made little Tiny very sad to see it. She did so love the little birds. All the summer they had sung and twittered for her so beautifully. But the mole pushed it aside with his crooked legs, and said: "He will sing no more now. How miserable it must be to be born a little bird! I am thankful that none of my children will ever be birds, for they can do nothing but cry, 'Tweet, tweet,' and always die of hunger in the winter." "Yes, you may well say that, you clever man!" exclaimed the field mouse. "What is the use of his twittering? For when winter comes he must either starve or be frozen to death. Still, birds are very high bred." Tiny said nothing, but when the others had turned their backs on the bird, she stooped down and stroked aside the soft feathers which covered the head, and kissed the closed eyelids. "Perhaps this was the one who sang to me so sweetly in the summer," she said, "and know how much pleasure it gave me, you dear pretty bird." The mole now stopped up the hole through which the daylight shone, and then accompanied Tiny and the field mouse home. But during the night Tiny could not sleep, so she got out of bed and wove a large, beautiful carpet of hay. Then she carried it to the dead bird, and spread it over him, with some down from the flowers which she had found in the field mouse's room. The down was as soft as wool, and she spread some of it on either side of the bird, so that he might lie warmly in the cold earth. "Farewell, you pretty little bird," said she. "Farewell! Thank you for your delightful singing during the summer, when all the trees were green and the warm sun shone upon us." Then she laid her head on the bird's breast. But she was alarmed immediately, for it seemed as if something inside the bird went thump, thump. It was the bird's heart. He was not really dead, only benumbed with the cold, and the warmth had restored him to life. In autumn all the swallows fly away into warm countries, but if one happens to linger, the cold seizes it. It becomes frozen, and falls down as if dead. It remains where it fell, and the cold snow covers it. Tiny trembled very much. She was quite frightened, for the bird was large, a great deal larger than herself. She was only an inch high. But she took courage, laid the wool more thickly over the poor swallow, and then took a leaf which she had used for her own counterpane and laid it over the head of the poor bird. The next morning she again stole out to see him. He was alive but very weak. He could only open his eyes for a moment to look at Tiny, who stood by holding a piece of decayed wood in her hand, for she had no other lantern. "Thank you, pretty little maiden," said the sick swallow. "I have been so nicely warmed, that I shall soon regain my strength, and be able to fly about in the warm sunshine." "Oh," she said, "it is cold out of doors now. It snows and freezes. Stay in your warm bed. I will take care of you." Then she brought the swallow some water in a flower leaf, and after he had drunk, he told her that he had wounded one of his wings in a thorn bush, and could not fly so fast as the other birds, who were soon far away on their journey to warm countries. Then at last he had fallen to the earth, and could remember no more, nor how he came to be where she had found him. The whole winter the swallow remained underground, and Tiny nursed him with care and love. Neither the mole nor the field mouse knew anything about it, for they did not like swallows. Very soon the springtime came, and the sun warmed the earth. Then the swallow bade farewell to Tiny, and she opened the hole in the ceiling which the mole had made. The sun shone in upon them so beautifully that the swallow asked her if she would go with him. She could sit on his back, he said, and he would fly away with her into the green woods. But Tiny knew it would make the field mouse very grieved if she left her in that manner, so she said, "No, I cannot." "Farewell, then, farewell, you good, pretty little maiden," said the swallow, and he flew out into the sunshine. Tiny looked after him, and the tears rose in her eyes. She was very fond of the poor swallow. "Tweet, tweet," sang the bird as he flew out into the green woods, and Tiny felt sad. She was not allowed to go out into the warm sunshine. The corn, which had been sown in the field over the house of the field mouse, had grown up high in the air and formed a thick wood to Tiny, who was only an inch high. "You are going to be married, Tiny," said the field mouse. "My neighbor has asked for you. What good fortune for a poor child like you! Now we will prepare your wedding clothes. They must be both woolen and linen. Nothing must be wanting when you are the mole's wife." Tiny had to turn the spindle, and the field mouse hired 4 spiders, who were to weave day and night. Every evening the mole visited her, and was continually speaking of the time when the summer would be over. Then he would keep his wedding day with Tiny. But now the heat of the sun was so great it burned the earth, and made it quite hard, like a stone. As soon as the summer was over, the wedding should take place. But Tiny was not at all pleased, for she did not like the tiresome mole. Every morning when the sun rose, and every evening when it went down, she would creep out at the door, and, as the wind blew aside the ears of corn, so that she could see the blue sky, she thought how beautiful and bright it seemed out there, and wished so much to see her dear swallow again. But he never returned, for by this time he had flown far away into the lovely green forest. When autumn arrived Tiny had her outfit quite ready, and the field mouse said to her, "In 4 weeks the wedding must take place." Then Tiny wept, and said she would not marry the disagreeable mole. "Nonsense!" replied the field mouse. "Now, don't be obstinate, or I shall bite you with my white teeth. He is a very handsome mole. The Queen herself does not wear more beautiful velvets and furs. His kitchen and cellars are quite full. You ought to be very thankful for such good fortune." So the wedding day was fixed, on which the mole was to fetch Tiny away to live with him, deep under the earth, and never again to see the warm sun, because he did not like it. The poor child was most unhappy at the thought of saying farewell to the beautiful sun, and, as the field mouse had given her permission to stand at the door, she went to look at it once more. "Farewell, bright sun!" she cried, stretching out her arm towards it. And then she walked a short distance from the house, for the corn had been cut, and only the dry stubble remained in the fields. "Farewell, farewell!" she repeated, twining her arm round a little red flower that grew just by her side. "Greet the little swallow from me, if you shall see him again." "Tweet, tweet!" sounded over her head suddenly. She looked up, and there was the swallow himself flying close by. As soon as he spied Tiny he was delighted, and then she told him how unwilling she felt to marry the ugly mole, and to live always beneath the earth, and never to see the bright sun any more. And as she told him she wept. "Cold winter is coming," said the swallow, "and I'm going to fly away into warmer countries. Will you go with me? You can sit on my back, and fasten yourself on with your sash. Then we can fly away from the ugly mole and his gloomy rooms, far away over the mountains into warmer countries, where the sun shines more brightly than here, where it is always summer, and the flowers bloom in greater beauty. Fly now with me, dear little Tiny. You saved my life when I lay frozen in that dark, dreary passage." "Yes, I will go with you," said Tiny, and she seated herself on the bird's back, with her feet on his outstretched wings, and tied her girdle to one of his strongest feathers. Then the swallow rose in the air and flew over forest and over sea, high above the highest mountains, covered with eternal snow. Tiny would have been frozen in the cold air, but she crept under the bird's warm feathers, keeping her little head uncovered, so that she might admire the beautiful lands over which they passed. At length they reached the warm countries, where the sun shines brightly, and the sky seems so much higher above the earth. Here, on the hedges and by the wayside, grew purple, green, and white grapes. Lemons and oranges hung from trees in the woods, and the air was fragrant with myrtles and orange blossoms. Beautiful children ran along the country lanes, playing with large gay butterflies, and, as the swallow flew farther and farther, every place appeared still more lovely. At last they came to a blue lake, and by the side of it, shaded by trees of the deepest green, stood a palace of dazzling white marble, built in the olden times. Vines clustered round its lofty pillars, and at the top were many swallows' nests, and one of these was the home of the swallow who carried Tiny. "This is my house," said the swallow, "but it would not do for you to live there. You would not be comfortable. You must choose for yourself one of those lovely flowers, and I will put you down upon it, and then you shall have everything that you can wish to make you happy." "That will be delightful!" she said, and clapped her little hands for joy. A large marble pillar lay on the ground, which, in falling, had been broken into three pieces. Between these pieces grew the most beautiful large white flowers. So the swallow flew down with Tiny, and placed her on one of the broad leaves. But how surprised she was to see, in the middle of the flowers, a tiny little man, as white and transparent as if he had been made of crystal. He had a gold crown on his head, and delicate wings at his shoulders, and was not much larger than Tiny herself. He was the Fairy of the Flower, for a tiny man and a tiny woman dwell in every flower, and this was the king of them all. "Oh, how beautiful he is!" whispered Tiny to the swallow. The little king was at first quite frightened at the bird, who was like a giant compared to such a delicate little creature as himself. But when he saw Tiny he was delighted, and thought her the prettiest little maiden he had ever seen. He took the gold crown from his head, and placed it on hers, and asked her name, and if she would be his wife and queen over all the flowers. This certainly was a very different sort of husband to the son of the toad or the mole, with his black velvet and fur, so she said yes, to the handsome king. Then all the flowers opened, and out of each came a little lady or tiny lord, all so pretty it was quite a pleasure to look at them. Each of them brought Tiny a present, but the best gift was a pair of beautiful wings, which had belonged to a large white fly, and they fastened them to Tiny's shoulders, so that she might fly from flower to flower. Then there was much rejoicing, and the little swallow, who sat above them in his nest, was asked to sing a wedding song, which he did as well as he could; but in his heart he felt sad, for he was very fond of Tiny, and would have liked never to part from her again. "You must not be called Tiny any more," said the Fairy of the Flowers to her. "It is an ugly name, and you are so very pretty. We will call you Maia." "Farewell, farewell!" said the swallow, with a heavy heart, as he left the warm countries, to fly back into Denmark. There he had a nest over the window of a house in which dwelt the writer of fairy tales. The swallow sang "Tweet, tweet," and from his song came this whole story. Hans Christian Andersen. End of chapter 70. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC.
Chapter number 71 of the Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. The Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud by Francis Jenkins OLCOTT. The Immortal Fountain. In ancient times, two little princesses lived in Scotland, one of whom was extremely beautiful, and the other dwarfish, dark-coloured, and deformed. One was named Rose, and the other Marion. The sisters did not live happily together. Marion hated Rose because the latter was handsome, and everybody praised her. So Marion scowled, and her face grew absolutely black when anybody asked how her pretty sister was. And once she was so wicked and jealous that she cut off all Rose's glossy golden hair, and threw it in the fire. Poor Rose cried bitterly about it, but she did not scold or strike her sister, for she was an amiable and gentle little being. No wonder, then, that all the family and all the neighbors disliked Marion, and no wonder that her face grew uglier and uglier every day. But the neighbors used to say that Rose had been blessed by the fairies, to whom she owed her extraordinary beauty and goodness. Not far from the castle where the princesses resided was a deep grotto, said to lead to the palace of beauty where the queen of the fairies held her court. Some said that Rose had fallen asleep there one day when she was tired of chasing a butterfly, and that the Queen had dipped her in an immortal fountain, from which she had risen with the beauty of an angel. Marion often asked Rose about this story, but the child always replied that she was forbidden to speak of it. When Rose saw any uncommon bird or butterfly, she would exclaim, "Oh, how much that looks like Fairyland!" But when asked what she knew about Fairyland, she blushed and would not answer. Marion thought a great deal about this. "Why can I not go to the Palace of Beauty?" thought she, "and why may I not bathe in the Immortal Fountain?" One summer's noon, when all was still save the faint twitterings of birds and the lazy hum of bees, Marion entered the deep grotto. She sat down on a bank of moss. The air around her was as fragrant as it came from a bed of violets, and with the far-off sound of music in her ears, she fell into a gentle slumber. When she awoke it was evening, and she found herself in a small hall, where opal pillars supported a rainbow roof, the bright reflection of which rested on crystal walls, and on a golden floor inlaid with pearls. All around, between the opal pillars, stood the tiniest vases of pure alabaster, in which grew a multitude of brilliant and fragrant flowers, some of which, twining around the pillars, were lost in the floating rainbow above. This scene of beauty was lighted by millions of fireflies glittering in the air like wandering stars. When Marion was gazing in amazement at all this, a little lady of rare loveliness stood before her. Her robe was of green and gold. Her flowing gossamer mantle was caught upon one shoulder with a pearl, and in her hair was a solitary star composed of 5 diamonds, each no bigger than a pin point. She smiled at Marion and sang: "The Fairy Queen hath rarely seen creature of earthly mold Within her door, on pearly floor, inlaid with shimmering gold. Mortal, all thou seest is fair. Quick, thy purposes declare." As she concluded, the song was taken up and thrice repeated by a multitude of soft voices in the distance. It seemed as if birds and insects joined in the chorus, and ever and anon between the pauses, the sound of a cascade was heard, whose waters fell in music. All these delightful sounds died away, and the Queen of the Fairies stood patiently awaiting Marion's answer. Curtsying low, and with a trembling voice, the little maiden said: "Will it please your Majesty to make me as handsome as my sister Rose?" The Queen smiled again. "I will grant your request," said she, "if you will promise to fulfill all the conditions I propose." Marion eagerly promised that she would. "The Immortal Fountain," continued the Queen, "is on the top of a high, steep hill. At 4 different places fairies are stationed around it, who guard it with their wands. None can pass except those who obey my orders. Go home now. For 1 week speak no ungentle word to your sister. At the end of that time come again to the grotto." Marion went home light of heart. Rose was in the garden, watering flowers, and the first thing Marion observed was that her sister's sunny hair had grown as long and beautiful as before it was cut off. The sight made her angry, and she was just about to snatch the watering pot from Rose's hand with cross words, when she remembered the fairy, and passed into the castle in silence. The end of the week arrived, and Marion had faithfully kept her promise. Again she entered the grotto. The Queen was feasting when Marion reached the hall with opal pillars. The bees had brought, as a gift, golden honey, and placed it on small rose-colored shells which adorned a crystal table. Bright butterflies floated about the head of the Queen, and fanned her with their wings. Fireflies flew near to give her light, and a large diamond beetle formed her footstool. After she had supped, a dewdrop on a violet petal was brought to her to bathe her royal fingers. Behind the Queen's chair hovered numerous bright fairies, but when Marion entered the diamond sparkles on their wings faded as they always do in the presence of anything bad, and in a second all the Queen's attendants vanished, singing as they went: "The Fairy Queen hath rarely seen creature of mortal mould Within her door, on pearly floor, inlaid with shining gold." "Mortal, have you fulfilled your promise?" asked the Queen. "I have," replied the maiden. "Then follow me." Marion did as she was directed, and away they hastened over beds of violets and mignonette. Birds sang, butterflies fluttered, and the voices of many fountains came on the breeze. Presently they reached the hill on top of which was the Immortal Fountain. The foot of the hill was surrounded by a band of fairies clothed in green gossamer, and with their ivory wands crossed to bar the ascent. The Queen waved her wand over them, and immediately they stretched their transparent wings and flew away. The hill was steep, and far, far up climbed the Queen and Marion. The air became more and more fragrant, and more distinctly they heard the sound of waters falling in music. At length they were stopped by another band of fairies, clothed in blue gossamer, with silver wands crossed. "Here," said the Queen, "our journey must end. You can go no farther until you have fulfilled the orders I shall give you. Go home now. For 1 month do by your sister as you would wish her to do by you, if you were Rose and she Marion." Marion promised and departed. She found the task harder than the first had been. When Rose asked her for playthings, she found it hard to give them gently and affectionately. When Rose talked to her, she wanted to go away in silence. And when a pocket mirror was found in her sister's room, broken into 1,000 pieces, she felt sorely tempted to conceal that she had done the mischief. But she was so anxious to be made beautiful that she did as she wished to be done by. All the household remarked how Marion had changed. "I love her dearly," said Rose. "She is so good and amiable." "So do I," said a dozen voices. Marion blushed deeply, and her eyes sparkled with pleasure. "How pleasant it is to be loved," thought she. At the end of the month she went to the grotto again. Again the Fairy Queen conducted her up the hill, and this time the fairies in blue lowered their silver wands and flew away. The two travelled on, higher and higher. The path grew steeper and steeper, but the fragrant air became more delicious, and more distinctly was heard the sound of waters falling in music. At length their course was stayed by a troop of fairies clothed in rainbow robes, and holding silver wands tipped with gold. In face and form they were far more beautiful than anything Marion had yet seen. "Here we must pause," said the Queen. "This boundary you cannot yet pass." "Why not?" asked the impatient Marion. "Because those who pass the rainbow fairies must be very pure," replied the Queen. "Am I not very pure?" asked the maiden. "All the people in the castle tell me how good I have grown." "Mortal eyes see only the outside," answered the Queen, "but those who pass the Rainbow Fairies must be pure in thought as well as action. Go home now. For 3 months never indulge in a wicked or envious thought. You shall then have a glimpse of the Immortal Fountain." Marion returned home. At the end of 3 months she again visited the hall with opal pillars. The Queen did not smile when she saw her, but in silence led the way up the hill toward the Immortal Fountain. The green fairies and the blue fairies flew away as they approached, but the Rainbow Fairies bowed low to the Queen, and kept their gold-tipped wands firmly crossed. Marion saw that the silver specks on the fairies' wings began to grow dim, and she burst into tears. "I know," said the Queen, "that you could not pass this boundary. Envy has been in your heart, but be not discouraged. For years you have been indulging in wrong feelings, and you must not wonder if it takes many months to drive them out. Go home and try once more." So poor Marion went sadly away, and when she visited the hall again, the Queen smiled, and touched her playfully with her wand. She then led her up the hill to the Immortal Fountain. The silver specks on the wings of the Rainbow Fairies shone bright as Marion approached, and the fairies lowered their wings and flew away. Now, every footstep was on flowers that yielded beneath the feet like a pathway of clouds. The delicious fragrance could almost be felt, and loud and clear and sweet came the sound of waters falling in music. And now Marion could see a cascade leaping and sparkling over crystal rocks. Above it rested a rainbow. The spray fell in pearls forming delicate foliage around the margin of the fountain, and deep and silent below the foam of the cascade was the Immortal Fountain of Beauty. Its amber-colored waves flowed over a golden bed, and many fairies were bathing in its waves, the diamonds in their hair gleaming like sunbeams on the water. "Oh, let me bathe in the fountain!" cried Marion, clapping her hands in delight. "Not yet," said the Queen. "Behold the purple fairies with golden wands that guard its brink." Marion looked, and saw beings lovelier than her eye had ever rested on. "You cannot pass them yet," said the Queen. "Go home. For 1 year drive from your heart all evil feelings, not for the sake of bathing in this fountain, but because goodness is lovely and desirable for its own sake. Then your work is done." Marion returned home. This was the hardest task of all, for she had been willing to be good, not because it was right, but because she wished to be beautiful. 3 times she sought the grotto, and 3 times she left in tears, for the golden specks on the wings of the purple fairies grew dim as she approached, and the golden wands were still crossed to shut her from the Immortal Fountain. But the 4th time the purple fairies lowered their wands, singing: "Thou hast scaled the mountain, go bathe in the fountain, rise fair to the sight, as an angel of light, go bathe in the fountain." Marion, full of joy, was about to plunge in, but the Queen touched her, saying: "Look in the mirror of the water. Art thou not already as beautiful as heart can wish?" Marion looked at herself, and saw that her eyes sparkled with new lustre. A bright colour shone in her cheeks, her hair waved softly about her face, and dimples played sweetly around her mouth. "But I have not touched the Immortal Fountain!" cried she, turning in surprise to the Queen. "True," replied the Queen, "but its waters have been within your soul. Know that a pure and happy heart, and gentleness towards others, are the only immortal fountains of beauty." Marion thanked the Queen, and joyfully returned home. Rose ran to meet her, and clasped her to her bosom fervently. "I know all," she said. "I have been in Fairyland, disguised as a bird. I have watched all your steps. When you first went to the grotto, I begged the Queen to grant your wish." Ever after the sisters lived longingly together. It was the remark of every one. "How handsome Marion has grown! The ugly scowl has departed from her face. Her eyes are so clear and gentle. Her mouth is so pretty and smiling. To my taste, she is as handsome as Rose." Lydia Maria Childe, adopted. End of chapter 71. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC.
Chapter 72 of the Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by phone. The Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud by Frances Jenkins OLCOTT. The Story of Childe Charity. Once upon a time there lived in the West Country a little girl who had neither father nor mother. They both died when she was very young, and left their daughter to the care of her uncle, who was the richest farmer in all that country. He had houses and lands, flocks and herds, many servants to work about his house and fields, a wife who had brought him a great dowry, and 2 fair daughters. All their neighbours, being poor, looked up to the family, insomuch that they imagined themselves great people. The father and mother were as proud as peacocks, the daughters thought themselves the greatest beauties in the world, and not one of the family would speak civilly to anybody they thought low. Now it happened that though she was their near relation, they had this opinion of the orphan girl, partly because she had no fortune, and partly because of her humble, kindly disposition. It was said that the more needy and despised any creature was, the more ready was she to befriend it, on which account the people of the West Country called her Childe Charity, and if she had any other name, I never heard it. Childe Charity was thought very mean in that proud house. Her uncle would not own her for his niece, her cousins would not keep her company, and her aunt sent her to work in a dairy, and to sleep in the back garret, where they kept all sorts of lumber and dry herbs for the winter. The servants learned the same tune, and Childe Charity had more work than rest among them. All the day she scoured pails, scrubbed dishes, and washed crockery-ware, but every night she slept in the back garret as sound as a princess could in her palace chamber. Her uncle's house was large and white, and stood among green meadows by a river's side. In front it had a porch covered with a vine, behind it had a farmyard and high granaries. Within there were 2 parlours for the rich, and 2 kitchens for the poor, which the neighbours thought wonderfully grand. And one day in the harvest season, when this rich farmer's corn had been all cut down and housed, he condescended so far as to invite his neighbourhood to a harvest supper. The West Country people came in their holiday clothes and best behaviour. Such heaps of cakes and cheese, such baskets of apples, and barrels of ale, had never been at feast before. They were making merry in kitchen and parlour, when a poor old woman came to the back door, begging for broken victuals and a night's lodging. Her clothes were coarse and ragged, her hair was scanty and grey, her back was bent, her teeth were gone. She had a squinting eye, a clubbed foot, and crooked fingers. In short, she was the poorest and ugliest old woman that ever came begging. The first who saw her was the kitchen maid, and she ordered her to be gone for an ugly witch. The next was the herd boy, and he threw her a bone over his shoulder. But Childe Charity, hearing the noise, came out from her seat at the foot of the lowest table, and asked the old woman to take her share of the supper, and sleep that night in her bed in the back garret. The old woman sat down without a word of thanks. All the company laughed at Childe Charity for giving her bed and her supper to a beggar. Her proud cousins said it was just like her mean spirit, but Childe Charity did not mind them. She scraped the pots for her supper that night and slept on a sack among the lumber, while the old woman rested in her warm bed. And the next morning, before the girl awoke, the old woman was up and gone, without so much as saying thank you or good morning. That day all the servants were sick after the feast, and mostly cross too, so you may judge how civil they were, when at supper time who should come back to the door but the old woman, again asking for broken victuals and a night's lodging. No one would listen to her or give her a morsel, till Childe Charity rose from her seat at the foot of the lowest table and kindly asked her to take her supper and sleep in her bed in the back garret. Again the old woman sat down without the word. Childe Charity scraped the pots for her supper and slept on the sack. In the morning the old woman was gone, but for 6 nights after, as sure as the supper was spread, there she was at the back door, and the little girl regularly asked her in. Childe Charity's aunt said she would let her get enough of beggars. Her cousins made continual game of what they called her genteel visitor. Sometimes the old woman said, "Child, why don't you make this bed softer? And why are your blankets so thin?" But she never gave her a word of thanks, nor a civil good morning. At last, on the 9th day from her first coming, when Childe Charity was getting used to scrape the pots and sleep on the sack, her accustomed knock came at the door, and there she stood with an ugly ashy-coloured dog, so stupid-looking and clumsy that no herd boy would keep him. "Good evening, my little girl," she said when Childe Charity opened the door. "I will not have your supper and bed tonight. I am going on a long journey to see a friend. But here is a dog of mine, whom nobody in all the West Country will keep for me. He is a little cross, and not very handsome, but I leave him to your care till the shortest day in all the year. Then you and I will count for his keeping." When the old woman had said the last word, she set off with such speed that Childe Charity lost sight of her in a minute. The ugly dog began to fawn upon her, but he snarled at everybody else. The servants said he was a disgrace to the house. The proud cousins wanted him drowned, and it was with great trouble that Childe Charity got leave to keep him in an old ruined cow-house. Ugly and cross as the dog was, he fawned on her, and the old woman had left him to her care. So the little girl gave him part of all her meals, and when the hard frost came, took him privately to her own back garret, because the cow-house was damp and cold in the long nights. The dog lay quietly on some straw in a corner. Childe Charity slept soundly, but every morning the servants would say to her, "What great light and fine talking was that in your back garret?" "There was no light but the moon shining in through the shutterless window, and no talk that I heard," said Childe Charity. And she thought they must have been dreaming. But night after night, when any of them awoke in the dark and silent hour that comes before the morning, they saw a light brighter and clearer than the Christmas fire, and heard voices like those of lords and ladies in the back garret. Partly from fear and partly from laziness, none of the servants would rise to see what might be there. At length, when the winter nights were at the longest, the little parlour maid, who did least work and got most favour, because she gathered news for her mistress, crept out of bed when all the rest were sleeping, and set herself to watch at a crevice of the door. She saw the dog lying quietly in the corner, Childe Charity sleeping soundly in her bed, and the moon shining through the shutterless window. But an hour before daybreak there came a glare of lights, and the sound of far-off bugles. The window opened, and in marched a troop of little men clothed in crimson and gold, and bearing every man a torch, till the room looked bright as day. They marched up with great reverence to the dog, where he lay on the straw, and the most richly clothed among them said, "Royal Prince, we have prepared the banquet hall. What will your highness please that we do next?" "Ye have done well," said the dog. "Now prepare the feast, and see that all things be in our first fashion, for the princess and I mean to bring a stranger who never feasted in our halls before." "Your highness's commands shall be obeyed," said the little man, making another reverence, and he and his company passed out of the window. By and by there was another glare of lights, and a sound like far-off flutes. The window opened, and there came in a company of little ladies clad in rose-coloured velvet, and carrying each a crystal lamp. They also walked with great reverence up to the dog, and the gayest among them said, "Royal Prince, we have prepared the tapestry. What will your highness please that we do next?" "Ye have done well," said the dog. "Now prepare the robes, and let all things be in our first fashion. For the princess and I will bring with us a stranger who never feasted in our halls before." "Your highness's commands shall be obeyed," said the little lady, making a low curtsy, and she and her company passed out through the window, which closed quietly behind them. The dog stretched himself out upon the straw, the little girl turned in her sleep, and the moon shone in on the back garret. The parlour maid was so much amazed, and so eager to tell this great story to her mistress, that she could not close her eyes that night, and was up before cockcrow. But when she told it, her mistress called her a silly wench to have such foolish dreams, and scolded her so that the parlour maid durst not mention what she had seen to the servants. Nevertheless, Childe Charity's aunt thought there might be something in it worth knowing. So next night, when all the house were asleep, she crept out of bed, and set herself to watch at the back garret door. There she saw exactly what the maid told her. The little men with the torches, and the little ladies with the crystal lamps, coming in, making great reverence to the dog, and the same words passed, only he said to the one, "Now prepare the presents," and to the other, "Prepare the jewels." And when they were gone, the dog stretched himself on the straw, Childe Charity turned in her sleep, and the moon shone in on the back garret. The mistress could not close her eyes any more than the maid from eagerness to tell the story. She woke up Childe Charity's rich uncle before cockcrow, but when he heard it, he laughed at her for a foolish woman, and advised her not to repeat the like before the neighbours, lest they should think that she had lost her senses. The mistress could say no more, and the day passed. But that night the master thought he would like to see what went on in the back garret, so when all the house were asleep, he slipped out of bed, and set himself to watch at the crevice in the door. The same thing happened again that the maid and the mistress saw. The little men in crimson with their torches, and the little ladies in rose-coloured velvet with their lamps, came in at the window, and made an humble reverence to the ugly dog, the one saying, "Royal Prince, we have prepared the presents," and the other, "Royal Prince, we have prepared the jewels." And the dog said to them all, "Ye have done well. Tomorrow come and meet me and the princess with horses and chariots, and let all things be in our first fashion, for we will bring a stranger from this house who has never travelled with us, nor feasted in our halls before." The little men and the little ladies said, "Your highness's commands shall be obeyed." When they had gone out through the window, the ugly dog stretched himself out on the straw. Childe Charity turned in her sleep, and the moon shone in on the back garret. The master could not close his eyes any more than the maid or the mistress, for thinking of this strange sight. He remembered to have heard his grandfather say that somewhere near his meadows there lay a path leading to the fairies' country, and the haymakers used to see it shining through the grey summer morning as the fairy bands went home. Nobody had heard or seen the like for many years, but the master concluded that the doings in his back garret must be a fairy business, and the ugly dog a person of great account. His chief wonder was, however, what visitor the fairies intended to take from his house, and after thinking the matter over he was sure it must be one of his daughters. They were so handsome and had such fine clothes. Accordingly, Childe Charity's rich uncle made it his first business that morning to get ready a breakfast of roast mutton for the ugly dog, and carry it to him in the old cow-house. But not a morsel would the dog taste. On the contrary, he snarled at the master, and would have bitten him if he had not run away with his mutton. "The fairies have strange ways," said the master to himself. But he called his daughters privately, bidding them dress themselves in their best, for he could not say which of them might be called into great company before nightfall. Childe Charity's proud cousins, hearing this, put on the richest of their silks and laces, and strutted like peacocks from kitchen to parlour all day, waiting for the call their father spoke of, while the little girls scoured and scrubbed in the dairy. They were in very bad humour when night fell and nobody had come. But just as the family were sitting down to supper, the ugly dog began to bark, and the old woman's knock was heard at the back door. Childe Charity opened it, and was going to offer her bed and supper as usual, when the old woman said, "This is the shortest day in all the year, and I am going home to hold a feast after my travels. I see you have taken good care of my dog, and now if you will come with me to my house, he and I will do our best to entertain you. Here is our company." As the old woman spoke there was a sound of far-off flutes and bugles, then a glare of lights, and a great company, clad so grandly that they shone with gold and jewels, came in open chariots, covered with gilding and drawn by snow-white horses. The first and finest of the chariots was empty. The old woman led Childe Charity to it by hand, and the ugly dog jumped in before her. The proud cousins, in all their finery, had by this time come to the door, but nobody wanted them. And no sooner was the old woman and her dog within the chariot than a marvellous change passed over them. For the ugly old woman turned at once to a beautiful young princess, with long yellow curls and a robe of green and gold, while the ugly dog at her side started up a fair young prince with nut-brown hair and a robe of purple and silver. "We are," said they, as the chariots drove on and the little girl sat astonished, "a prince and princess of Fairyland, and there was a wager between us whether or not there were good people still to be found in these false and greedy times. One said yes, and the other said no. And I have lost," said the prince, "and I must pay the feast and presents." Some of the farmer's household, who were looking after them through the moonlight night, said the chariots had gone one way across the meadows. Some said they had gone another, and till this day they cannot agree upon the direction. But Childe Charity went with that noble company into a country such as she had never seen, for primroses covered all the ground, and the light was always like that of a summer evening. They took her to a royal palace, where there was nothing but feasting and dancing for 7 days. She had robes of pale green velvet to wear, and slept in a chamber inlaid with ivory. When the feast was done, the prince and princess gave her such heaps of gold and jewels that she could not carry them, but they gave her a chariot to go home in, drawn by 6 white horses. And on the 7th night, which happened to be Christmas time, when the farmer's family had settled in their own minds that she would never come back, and were sitting down to supper, they heard the sound of her coachman's bugle, and saw her alight with all the jewels and gold at the very back door where she had brought in the ugly old woman. The fairy chariot drove away, and never came back to that farmhouse after, but Childe Charity scrubbed and scoured no more, for she grew a great lady, even in the eyes of her proud cousins. End of chapter 72. Recording by Foon.
Chapter 73 of the Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud by Francis Jenkins OLCOTT. Chapter 73. The Shining Child and the Wicked Mouche. How the Rich Cousins Came. Once upon a time, a noble but poor count lived in the lovely land of Alsace. He dwelt in a charming little house on a hill. All around the house the graceful trees stretched out their leafy branches like arms, as if they were saying, "Welcome, welcome among us." Not far from the house was a thick green wood filled with birds and flowers and scented grasses. The good count did not live alone in this delightful spot. No, indeed. His wife and his 2 children, Fanchon and Frederic, lived with him, happy and contented. Now one summer the news arrived that a wealthy and distinguished nobleman, cousin of the count, was coming the next day with his family to call upon his poor relatives. The following morning the countess got up very early and baked a cake, into which she put more almonds and raisins than she ever put into her Easter cakes, so that its delicious fragrance filled the house. The count dusted and brushed his old green waistcoat, while Fanchon and Frederic, dressed in their best clothes, sat waiting for the guests to come. "You must not run about in the wood as you usually do," said the Count to them, "but sit very still, so that you will look clean and neat when your cousins arrive." So the poor children were forced to stay in the house. The morning sun was peeping bright and smiling from behind a cloud, and was darting his rays in at the window. Out in the wood the breeze was blowing sweet and fresh, and the robins, the thrushes, the goldfinches, and the nightingales were all warbling their loveliest songs. Poor Fanchon sat still and listened, sometimes smoothing the bow on her pink sash, sometimes knitting a bit, and all the while longing to run away to the wood. As for Frederic, he was looking at a picture book, but he kept jumping up every minute to gaze out at the window, for the big house dog, Pepin, was barking and bounding before the window as if to say, "Aren't you coming out? What in the world are you doing in that stuffy room?" And so Fanchon and Frederic had to remain in the house, and this was all the more painful because the company cake, which was on the table, gave out the most delicious spicy odours, yet might not be cut until the cousins came. "Oh, that they would only come, the children cried, and almost wept with impatience. At last the loud tramping of horses was heard, and the rumble of wheels. Then a carriage approached, so brilliant and so covered with golden ornaments that the children were amazed, for they had never seen anything like it. The carriage stopped before the house, and a very tall, thin gentleman glided out with the help of a footman, and fell into the arms of the Count, to whose cheek he gently pressed his lips. Then the footman aided a stout, red-faced woman to alight, while two children, a boy and a girl, stepped languidly down after her. When they were all safely in the house, Fanchon and Frederic came forward and curtsied politely as their father had told them to do. Then each seized a hand of the tall gentleman, saying, "We are glad you are come, noble cousin," after which they permitted the red-faced lady to embrace them. Then they went up to the children, but stood before them silent and amazed. Indeed, these rich children were wonderfully dressed. The boy wore a little jacket of scarlet cloth embroidered with gold and ornamented with gold tassels. A bright little sword hung at his side. On his head was a curious red cap with a white feather, from under which peeped his yellow face and bleared eyes. The little girl had on a white dress, all ribbons, lace, and bows, and her hair was frizzled and curled into a knot, on top of which was a shining coronet. Fanchon plucked up her courage and was going to take the little girl's hand, but she snatched it away in such a hurry and looked so tearful and angry that Fanchon was frightened and let her alone. Frederic wished to have a closer look at the boy's sword, and put out his hand to touch it, when the youngster began to shout and cry, "My sword! My sword! He's going to take my sword!" and ran to his father and hid behind him. After that, Fanchon and Frederic stood back quietly while their mother cut the cake, and the older people talked. The two rich children sat munching dry crackers, for their parents said that cake was not good for them. But Fanchon and Frederic each had a large slice, which their dear mother gave them. After they had finished eating, the guests arose to say good-bye, and the glittering carriage was driven to the door. The footman took from it two large bandboxes. These the rich children handed, with condescending pride, to Fanchon and Frederic. And just as the guests were about to take their leave, the big dog Pepin, Frederic's faithful friend and darling, came dancing and barking around them. The rich children screamed and had to be lifted, kicking with fright, into the carriage, which immediately drove away. So ended the visit of these wealthy and distinguished noble cousins. The New Playthings. After the carriage containing the wealthy cousins had rolled down the hill, the Count threw off his green waistcoat and put on his loose jacket and ran his fingers through his hair. The children, too, quickly got out of their best clothes, and felt light and happy. "To the wood! To the wood!" shouted Frederic, jumping as high as he could for joy. "But don't you wish to see what is in these handsome bandboxes your cousins gave you?" asked their mother. And Fanchon, who had been gazing at the bandboxes with longing eyes, cried out, "Can't we open them first and go to the wood afterward?" But Frederick was hard to convince. "Surely that stupid boy could not have brought anything worth while," said he scornfully, "nor his ribbony sister. He talked so boldly about bears and lions, but when my dear Pepin barked, he forgot his sword and hid under the table. A brave sportsman he!" "Oh, dear good brother," cried Fanchon, "just let us take one peep at what is in the boxes." So Frederick, who always did what he could to please his sister, gave up the idea of being off to the wood at once, and sat down patiently beside the table where the bandboxes were. The mother opened them, and then, oh, my dear readers, if you could have seen what lay within! The loveliest toys were in those boxes, and candies, and sweet cakes, and nuts. The children clapped their hands again and began crying, "Oh, how nice! Oh, how delicious!" They took them all out of the boxes and piled them on the table. None of the toys caused Frederick such satisfaction as did a little hunter, who, when a string that stuck out from his jacket was pulled, put a gun to his shoulder and fired at a target. Next to him in Frederick's affections was a little fellow who bowed and twanged on a harp whenever Frederick turned a tiny handle, and what pleased him nearly as much was a shotgun made of wood and a hunting pouch and belt. Fanchon was equally delighted with a beautiful doll, a trunk filled with dolls' dresses, tiny shoes, hats, and other lovely clothes, and a set of charming dolls' furniture. The children forgot all about the wood, and enjoyed themselves with their playthings until quite late in the evening. Then they went to bed and slept soundly. What happened to the playthings in the wood? The next morning the children got their boxes and took out the playthings and began to play. Then, just as on the day before, the sun shone brightly in at the windows, the trees rustled in the breeze, and the birds sang their loveliest songs. At last Frederick cried out, "Why do we sit here in this stuffy room? I'll tell you what we'll do. Come, Fanchon, let us be off to the wood." Fanchon had just undressed her doll and was going to put it to bed. "Why can't we stay here," she begged, "and play a little longer, Frederick?" "I'll tell you what we'll do," he replied. "We'll take our toys out to the wood. I'll put on my pouch and belt and carry my gun. I'll be a real sportsman. The hunter and the harper may come too, and you may take your doll. Come along, let us be off." Fanchon hastened to dress her doll. Then they both ran out of the house and off to the wood. There they sat down on a nice grassy spot, and after they had played a while, Fanchon said, "Do you know, Frederick, that harper of yours does not play very well. Just listen how funny his harp sounds out here in the wood, with that eternal ting, ting, ping, ping." Frederick turned the handle more violently. "You're right, Fanchon," said he. "What the little fellow plays sounds quite horrible. He must make a better job of it." And with that he unscrewed the handle with such force that, crack, crack, the box on which the harper stood flew into 1,000 splinters, and the arms of the little fellow were broken and hung useless at his sides. "Oh, oh!" cried Frederick. "Ah, the poor little harper!" sighed Fanchon. "Well, he was a stupid creature," said Frederick. "He played very poor music, and bowed, and made faces like our yellow-faced cousin who gave him to us." And as Frederick spoke, he threw the harper into a thicket. "What I like is my hunter," he continued. "He hits the bull's-eye every time he fires." And with that Frederick jerked the string so violently that, twang, twang, the target was broken, and the little man's arms hung limp and motionless. "Ah, ah!" cried Frederick. "You could shoot at your target indoors, but out here you can't shoot at all." And so saying, Frederick, with all his might, shied the hunter after the harper into the thicket. "Come, let us run about a bit," said he to Fanchon. "Ah, yes, let us," said she. "This lovely doll of mine shall run with us. It shall be great fun." So Fanchon and Frederic each took an arm of the doll, and off they ran through the bushes, on and on, until they came to a small lake, and there they stopped. And Frederic said, "Suppose we wait a minute. I have a gun now, and perhaps I may hit a duck among the rushes." At that moment Fanchon screamed out, "Oh, just look at my doll! What's the matter with her?" Indeed, the poor thing was in a miserable condition. Neither Fanchon nor Frederic had been paying any attention to her, and the bushes had torn all the clothes off her back. Both her legs were broken, and her pretty waxen face was covered with so many scratches that it was hideous to look at. "Oh, my beautiful, beautiful child!" sobbed Fanchon. "There, you see what a stupid creature that doll of yours is," cried Frederic. "She can't even take a little run, but she must tear and spoil her clothes. Give her to me." And before Fanchon could say a word or cry, "Oh, oh!" Frederic snatched the doll and flung her into the lake. "Never mind, Fanchon," he said consolingly. "Never mind. If I can shoot a duck, you shall have the most beautiful wing feathers." Just then a noise was heard among the rushes, and Frederic instantly took aim with his wooden gun, but he dropped it quickly from his shoulder, saying, "Am I not an idiot? How can a fellow shoot a duck without powder and shot? What's the use of this stupid wooden thing anyway?" And with that he flung the gun and his pouch and belt into the lake. But poor Fanchon was weeping at the loss of her doll, and Frederic was annoyed at the way things had turned out. So they both crept back sadly to the house. And when their mother asked them what had become of the playthings, Frederic truthfully related how they had been deceived by the harper, the hunter, the doll, and all. "Ah, you foolish children!" cried their mother, half in anger. "You do not deserve to have nice toys." But the Count, who had been listening to Frederic's tale, said, "Let the children alone. I am really glad that they are fairly rid of those playthings. There was something queer about them." But neither the children nor their mother understood what the Count meant. The Stranger Child. Soon after these events, very early one morning, Fanchon and Frederic ran off to the wood. They were feeling sad, for their mother had told them that they must return home soon to study, so as to be ready for the tutor that their rich cousin had promised to send them, for the tutor was expected shortly. "Let us run and jump as much as we can now," said Frederic when they reached the wood, "for in a little while we shall not be allowed to stay out here at all." So they began to play hide and seek. But everything went wrong. The wind carried Frederic's hat into the bushes. He stumbled and fell on his nose as he was running. Fanchon found herself hanging by her clothes on a thorn tree, and she banged her foot against a sharp stone so that she shrieked with pain. In fact, the children could not understand what was the matter with them on this particular day, and they gave up their game and slunk dejectedly through the wood. Frederic threw himself down under a shady tree, and Fanchon followed his example, and there the two children lay, gloomy and wretched, gazing on the ground. "Ah," said Fanchon, "if only we had our playthings." "Nonsense," said Frederic. "What should we do with them?" "I'll tell you what it is, Fanchon. Mother is right, I suspect. The toys were good enough, but we didn't know how to play with them. If we were as learned as our rich cousins, we should be so wise that all our toys would now be whole, and we should know how to play with them rightly." And at that Fanchon began to sob and cry bitterly, and Frederic joined her, and they both howled and lamented until the wood rang again and again. "Oh, poor unfortunate children that we are! Oh, that we weren't as wise as our cousins!" But suddenly they both stopped crying and asked each other in amazement, "Did you hear anything, Fanchon? Did you hear anything, Frederic?" For out of the deepest shade of the dark thicket in front of the children, a wonderful brightness began to shine, playing like moonlight over the leaves that trembled as if in joy. And then, through the whispering trees, came a sweet musical note, like the sound of a harp. The children lay motionless with awe. All their sorrows passed away from them, and tender, happy tears rose into their eyes. As the radiance streamed brighter and brighter through the bushes, and the marvelous music grew louder and louder, the children's hearts beat high. They gazed eagerly at the brightness. Then they saw, smiling at them from the thicket, the most beautiful face of a child with the sun beaming on it in splendour. "Oh, come to us, darling shining child!" cried Fanchon and Frederic, stretching out their arms, and their hearts were filled with an indescribable longing. "I am coming, a sweet voice cried from the bushes, and then, as if borne on the wings of the breeze, the stranger child seemed to float hovering toward Fanchon and Frederic. How the shining child played with Fanchon and Frederic. "What is the matter, dear children?" asked the stranger child. "I heard you crying and lamenting, and I was very sorry for you. What do you want?" "Ah," said Frederic, "we did not know what we wanted, but now I see that we wanted you, just you yourself." "That's it," chimed in Fanchon. "Now that you are with us, we are happy again. Why were you so long in coming?" In fact, both children felt as if they had known and played with the stranger child all their lives, and that their unhappiness had been because their beloved playmate was not with them. "You see," Frederic added, "we have no toys left, for I, like a stupid dolt, broke all our fine things and shied them into the thicket." At this the stranger child laughed merrily and cried, "Why, Fanchon and Frederic, you are lying this minute among the loveliest playthings that ever were seen." "Where are they?" Fanchon and Frederic both cried. "Look around you," said the stranger child. And then Fanchon and Frederic saw how out of the thick grass and moss all sorts of coloured flowers were peeping, with bright eyes gleaming, and between them many-coloured stones and crystal shells sparkled and shone, while little golden insects danced up and down, humming gentle songs. "Now we will build a palace," said the stranger child. "Help me to get the stones together." And it stooped down and began to pick up stones of many pretty colours. Fanchon and Frederic helped, and the stranger child placed the beautiful stones one upon another, and soon there rose tall pillars shining in the sun, while an airy golden roof stretched itself from pillar to pillar. Then the stranger child kissed the flowers that were peeping from the grass, and whispered to them lovingly, and they shot up higher, and twining together, formed sweet-scented arbours and covered walks in which the children danced about, full of delight and gladness. The stranger child clapped its hands, and immediately the golden roof that was made of insects' golden wings fell to pieces with a hum, and the pillars melted away into a splashing silver stream, on whose banks flowers grew and peeped into the water. Then the stranger child plucked little blades of grass and gathered twigs from trees, strewing them on the ground before Fanchon and Frederic. The blades of grass turned into the prettiest little live dolls ever seen, and the twigs became gay little huntsmen. The dolls danced around Fanchon and let her take them into her lap, and they whispered in such delicate little voices, "Be kind to us, love us, dear Fanchon." The huntsmen shouted, "Halloa! Halloa! The hunt is up!" and blew their horns and bustled about. Then tiny hares came darting out of the bushes with tiny dogs after them, and the huntsmen pursued them with shouts. This was delightful. Then suddenly these wonders disappeared, and Fanchon and Frederic cried out, "What has become of the dolls? Where are the huntsmen?" The stranger child answered, "Oh, they are always here waiting for you. They are close beside you, so you may have them at any minute. But just now, would you not rather go with me through the wood?" "Oh, yes, yes!" cried Fanchon and Frederic. The stranger child took hold of their hands, crying, "Come, come!" And with that, off they went. The children felt themselves floating along lightly and easily through the trees, while all the birds flew fluttering beside them, singing and warbling their sweetest songs. And then suddenly they soared into the air. Higher and higher they mounted like birds skimming above the tops of the trees. Frederick shouted with delight, but Fanchon was frightened. "Oh, my breath is going! I shall tumble!" she cried. And just at that moment the stranger child let them gently to the ground and said, "Now I shall sound my forest song, then goodbye for today." And the stranger child took out a little horn of wreathed gold and began to sound it so beautifully that the whole wood re-echoed wondrously with its lovely music, while a host of nightingales came flocking to the branches above the children's heads and sang their most melodious songs. But all at once the music grew fainter and fainter, and only a soft whispering seemed to come from the thicket into which the stranger child had vanished. "Tomorrow, tomorrow I will come again," the children heard breathed gently, as if from a distance. Then they sighed with joy, for though they could not understand it, never had they known such happiness in all their lives. "Oh, I wish it was tomorrow now," they both cried, as they hastened home to their parents. How the Forest Talked to Fanchon and Frederick. "I should fancy that the children had dreamed all this," said the Count to his wife, when Fanchon and Frederick, who could think of nothing else but the stranger child and the wonderful events and the exquisite music, had told all that had happened. "I should fancy that they had dreamed all this, if they had not both seen the same things. I cannot get to the bottom of it all." "Don't bother your head about it, my dear," answered his wife. "I think this stranger child was nobody but the schoolmaster's son from the village. We must take care that he is not allowed to put any more such nonsense into the children's heads." But the Count did not agree with her, for he called the children to him again to tell how the stranger child was dressed and looked. Fanchon and Frederick both agreed that its face was fair as lilies, that it had cheeks like roses, cherry lips, bright blue eyes, and locks of gold, and that it was more beautiful than words could tell. But what they said about its dress sounded absurd, for Fanchon said that its dress was wondrous beautiful, shining and gleaming as if made of the petals of flowers, while Frederick insisted that its garments were of sparkling golden green, like spring leaves in the sunshine. And Frederick thought the stranger child was a boy, while Fanchon was sure that it was a girl. And these contradictions confused their parents, and the Count shook his head wonderingly. The next day Fanchon and Frederick hastened to the wood, and found the stranger child waiting for them. If their play had been glorious the day before, it was 10 times more glorious today, for the stranger child did such marvellous things that Fanchon and Frederick shouted for joy. While they played, the stranger child talked sweetly to the trees, flowers, and birds, and to the brook that ran through the wood, and they all answered so clearly that Fanchon and Frederick understood everything they said. "Dear children," cried the alder thicket, "why were you not here early when my friend the morning breeze came rustling over the blue hills, and brought us thousands of greetings and kisses from the golden queen of the dawn, and plenty of wing waftings full of sweet perfumes?" "Oh, silence!" the flowers broke in. "Do not mention that robber the morning breeze. Does he not steal our perfumes? Never mind the alders, children. Let them lisp and whisper. Listen to us. We love you so. We dress ourselves in the loveliest colours just for you." "And do we not love you, beautiful flowers?" said the stranger child tenderly. But Fanchon knelt down on the grass, and stretched out her arms as if she would take all the bright flowers to her heart, and cried, "Oh, I love you! I love you, every one!" Then came a sighing out of the tall, dark fir trees, and they said, "We shade the flowers from the hot sun, and shelter human children when the storm comes rushing through the woods. But who loves us in return?" "Groan and sigh," cried Frederick, "and murmur as much as you like, you green giants that you are. It is then that the real woodsman's heart rejoices in you. I love all the green bushes, the flowers, and you trees." "You are quite right," splashed the brook as it sparkled over its stones. "Come sit down amongst this moss, dear children, and listen to me. I come from afar. Out of a deep, cool, dark rock I gush. Look into my waves, and I will show you the loveliest pictures in my clear mirror, the blue of the sky, the fleecy clouds, bushes, trees, and blossoms, and your very selves, dear children, I draw tenderly into my transparent bosom." "Fanchon and Frederic," said the stranger child, looking around with wondrous blissfulness, "only listen how they all love us. But the redness of evening is rising behind the hills, and the nightingale is calling me home." "Oh, but first let us fly a little, as we did yesterday," begged Frederic. "Yes," said Fanchon, "but not quite so high. It makes my head giddy." Then the stranger child took them each by the hand again, and they went soaring up into the golden purple of the evening sky, while the birds crowded and sang around them. Among the shining clouds Frederic saw, as if in a wavering flame, beautiful castles, all of rubies and other precious stones. "Look, look, Fanchon!" he cried, full of rapture. "Look at those splendid palaces! Let us fly along as fast as we can, and we shall soon get to them." Fanchon, too, saw the castles, and forgot her fear, and kept looking upward. "Those are my beloved castles in the air," the stranger child said, "but we must go no farther to-day." Fanchon and Frederic seemed to be in a dream, and could not make out how they suddenly came to find themselves with their father and mother. The Palace of the Fairy Queen. It was the next day. In the most beautiful part of the wood, beside the brook, between whispering bushes, the stranger child had set up a glorious tent made of tall, slender lilies, glowing roses, and tulips of every hue. And beneath this tent Fanchon and Frederic were seated with the stranger child, listening to the forest brook as it whirled and rippled and sang its wonderful stories. "Tell us," said Fanchon, "darling, shining child, where your home is, and all about your father and mother." The stranger child looked sorrowfully at the sky. "Ah, my dear," it said with a sigh, "is it not enough that I come to you each day? Why must you then ask about my home? Though you were to travel day after day, forever and ever, even to beyond the utmost range of the purple hills, you could not reach it." "Ah me!" sighed Fanchon. "Then you must live hundreds and hundreds of miles away from us. Is it only on a visit that you are here?" "Fanchon, beloved," said the stranger child, "whenever you long for me with all your heart, I am with you immediately, bringing you all those plays and wonders. Is that not as good as being in my home?" "Not at all," said Frederic, "for I believe that you live in a most glorious place. I do not care how hard the road is to your home. I mean to set out this minute for it." "And so you shall," said the stranger child, smiling. "For when you see all this so clearly before you, and make up your mind to be there, it is as good as done. The land where I live, in truth, is so beautiful and glorious that I can give you no description of it. It is my mother who reigns over that land, all glory and loveliness, as queen." "Ah, you are a prince!" cried Frederic. "Ah, you are a princess!" cried Fanchon. "I certainly am," said the stranger child. "My mother's palace is far more beautiful than those glittering castles you saw in the evening clouds, for the gleaming pillars of her palace are of the purest crystal, and they soar slender and tall into the blue of heaven. Upon them rests a great wide blue canopy. Beneath the canopy sail the shining white clouds hither and thither on golden wings. And the red of the evening and the morning rises and falls, and the sparkling stars dance in a singing circle around her palace. You have heard of the fairies who can bring about great wonders. My mother is queen of the fairies. Very often she holds a feast for little children. It is then that the elves belonging to my mother's kingdom fly through the air, weaving shining rainbows from one end of her palace to the other. Under these rainbows they build my mother's diamond throne, that in appearance and perfume is like lilies, roses, and carnations. My mother takes her place upon the throne, and the elves sing and play on golden harps. As soon as their music begins, everything in the palace, in the woods and gardens, moves and sings. And all around there are thousands of beautiful little children in charming dresses, shouting with delight. The children chase each other amongst the golden trees and throw blossoms at each other. They climb the trees where the wind swings and rocks them. They gather gold glittering fruit, and they play with tame deer and other gentle wild creatures that come bounding up to them and lick their hands. Then the children run up and down the rainbows, or they ride on the backs of great purple birds that fly up among the gleaming clouds. "How delightful that must be!" cried Fanchon and Frederic with rapture. "Oh, take us with you to your home, beautiful shining child. We want to stay there always." "That may not be," said the stranger child, and Fanchon and Frederic cast down their eyes sadly to the ground. The wicked Mouche. "Ah," said the stranger child, "you might not be so happy at my mother's court. Indeed, it would be a great misfortune for you to try to go to her kingdom. There are many children who cannot bear the singing of the purple birds, and if they hear their songs, they die. Then, too, destruction might overtake you before you could reach my mother's court. Even I am not safe on my way thither. There was a time when I was safe anywhere. But now a bitter enemy of my mother, whom she banished from her kingdom, goes raging about the world, and I cannot be safe from being watched, pursued, and molested. Powerless as this bitter enemy is when I am at home, nothing can protect me from him when I am flying abroad." "What sort of a hateful creature is it," asked Fanchon, "that can do you so much harm?" "I have told you," said the stranger child, "that my mother is the Fairy Queen. Among her many elves are some who hover in the sky or dwell in the waters, and others who serve at the fairy court. Once, long ago, there came among us, those that served at court, a stranger who called himself Papillon. He said that he was learned in all the sciences of the world, and could accomplish great things among us. My mother made him Prime Minister. Papillon soon showed his natural spite and wickedness. He pretended to the Queen that he loved children and could make them very happy. But instead of doing so, he hung himself like a weight of lead on the tails of the purple birds, so that they could not fly aloft. And when the children climbed the rose trees, he dragged them down by the legs. Then he knocked their noses on the ground and made them bleed. When the children sang, he crammed all sorts of nasty stuff down their throats, for sweet and happy singing he could not abide. And worst of all, he had a way of smearing the sparkling precious stones of the palace, and the lilies and roses, and even the shining rainbows with a horrible black juice, so that everything beautiful became sorrowful or dead. And when he had done all this, he gave a loud hissing laugh, and said that everything was now as he wished it to be. Then, shouting that he was greater than my mother, he went flying up into the air in the shape of an enormous fly with flashing eyes and a long snout. After which he went humming and buzzing around my mother's throne in a most abominable fashion. When the Queen, my mother, and her elves saw this, they knew that he had come among them under a false name, and that he was none other than Mouche, the gloomy king of the gnomes. The entire fairy court thereupon rushed against him, beating him with their wings, while the purple birds seized him with their glittering beaks, and gripped him so tightly that he screamed with agony and rage, after which the birds shook him violently and threw him down to the earth. he fell straight onto the back of his old aunt, who was a great blue toad, and she carried him off to her hole. But 500 of the children in the fairy court armed themselves with fly flappers to defend themselves against the Mouche, should he ever venture to return. Now after he was gone, all the black juice disappeared, and everything became as shining and glorious as before. So you see, dear children, continued the stranger child, what kind of creature I have to fear. This horrible Mouche follows me about, and if I did not hide myself quickly he would injure me. And I assure you that if I were to take you with me to my home, Mouche would lie in wait for us and kill us. Fanchon wept bitterly at the danger to which the stranger child was exposed, but Frederic said, "If that horrible Mouche is nothing but a great fly, I'll soon hit him with father's big fly flapper. And if once I give him a good crack on his nose, Auntie Blue Toad will have a job carrying him to her hole again." How Tutor Ink arrived to teach the children. Fanchon and Frederic ran home as fast as they could, shouting as they went, "Oh, the shining child is a beautiful princess! Oh, the shining child is a beautiful prince!" They wanted, in their delight, to tell this to their parents, but their father came to meet them with a most extraordinary man walking by his side. This stranger kept muttering to himself, "What a nice pair of stupids these are! Ha! Ha!" The Count took him by the hand and said to the children, "This gentleman is the tutor whom your kind cousin has sent to teach you. So now shake hands with him and bid him welcome." But the children looked sideways at him and could move neither hand nor foot. This was because they had never seen such an extraordinary being. He was no taller than Frederic. His body was round and bloated, and his little weazen legs could hardly support its weight. His head was queer and square, and his eyes too ugly for anything, for not only was his nose long and pointed, but his little bulging eyes glittered, and his wide mouth was open in a ferocious way. He was clad in black from top to toe, and his name was Tutor Ink. Now as the children stood staring like stone images, their mother cried angrily, "You rude children, what are you thinking of? Come, come, give the tutor your hands." The children, taking heart, did as their mother bade them, but as soon as Tutor Ink took hold of their hands, they jumped back, screaming, "Oh, oh, that hurts!" The tutor laughed aloud and showed a needle which he had hidden in his hand to prick the children with. Fanchon was weeping, but Frederic growled, "Just try that again, little big body, if you dare." "Why did you do that, Tutor Ink?" asked the Count, somewhat annoyed. "Well, it's just my way," answered Tutor Ink. "I can't alter it." And with that he stuck his hands to his sides and went on laughing until his voice sounded like the noise of a broken rattle. Alas! After that there was no more running about in the wood. Instead, the children, day after day, had to sit in the house, repeating after Tutor Ink strange gibberish, not one word of which they could understand. With what longing eyes they looked at the wood! Often they thought they heard, amidst the happy songs of the birds and the rustling of the trees, the voice of the stranger child, calling and calling, "Fanchon! Frederic! Are you not coming to play with me? Oh, come! I have made you a palace all of flowers. We will play there, and I will give you all sorts of beautiful stones. And then we'll fly through the air and build cloud castles. Come! Oh, come!" At this the children's thoughts were so drawn to the wood that they neither heard nor saw their tutor any longer, although he thumped on the table with both fists, and hummed, and growled, and snarled. At last one day the Count perceived how pale the children were getting, and bade Tutor Ink take them for a walk. The tutor did not like the idea at all, and the children did not like it either, saying, "What business has Tutor Ink in our darling wood?" What happened when Tutor Ink took the children to the wood? "Well, Tutor Ink, is it not delightful here in our wood?" asked Frederic. Tutor Ink made a face and muttered, "Stupid nonsense. All one does is tear his stockings. One can't hear a word because of the abominable screeching of all the birds." "But surely you love the flowers," Fanchon chimed in. At this, Tutor Ink's face became a deep cherry color, and he beat his hands about him, crying, "Stupid nonsense! Ridiculous nonsense! There are no decent flowers in this wood." "But don't you see those dear little lilies of the valley peeping up at you with such bright, loving eyes?" asked Fanchon. What? The tutor screamed. "Flowers! Eyes? Ha ha! Nice eyes! Useless things!" And with that he stooped, and plucking up a handful of the lilies, roots and all, threw them into the thicket. Fanchon could not help shedding bitter tears, and Frederick gnashed his teeth in anger. Just then a little robin alighted on a branch near the tutor's head, and began to sing sweetly. The tutor, picking up a stone, threw it, and the bird fell dying to the ground. Frederick could restrain himself no longer. "You horrible Tutor Ink!" he cried. "What did the little bird do to you that you should strike it dead?" And looking toward the thicket, he called sadly, "Oh, where are you, beautiful shining child? Oh, come, only come. Let us fly far, far away. I cannot stay beside this horrible creature any longer." And Fanchon, stretching out her hands, sobbed and wept bitterly. "Oh, you darling shining child!" she cried. "Come to us! Come to us! Save us! Save us! Tutor Ink is killing us, as he is killing the flowers and birds." "What do you mean by the shining child?" snarled Tutor Ink. But at that instant there was a loud whispering and rustling in the thicket, and a sound as of muffled drums tolling in the distance. Then the children saw, in a shining cloud that floated above them, the beautiful face of the stranger child, and tears like glittering pearls were rolling down its rosy cheeks. "Ah, my darling playmates," it cried, "I cannot come to you any more. Farewell, farewell. The gnome Mouche has you in his power. Oh, you poor children! Goodbye, goodbye." And then the stranger child soared up far into the clouds, and the most marvelous thing happened. Behind the children there began a most horrid, fearsome buzzing and humming, snarling and growling, and lo, Tutor Ink had changed into an enormous, frightful-looking fly, and he began to fly upward heavily, following the stranger child. Fanchon and Frederick, overpowered with terror, ran out of the wood and did not dare look up at the sky until they had gotten some distance away, and then, when they did so, all that they could see was a shining speck in the clouds, glittering like a star, coming nearer and downward. The star grew bigger and bigger, and the children could hear as if it were the call of a trumpet, and presently they saw that the star was really a splendid bird with shining purple plumage. It came dropping down to the wood, clapping its mighty wings, singing loud and clear. "Hurrah! Hurrah!" shouted Frederick. "That is a purple bird from the fairy court. He will bite Tutor Ink to death. The shining child is saved, and so are we. Come, Fanchon, let us get home as fast as we can and tell our father about it." What the Count Did to Tutor Ink. The children burst into the house where their parents were sitting. "Hurrah! Hurrah!" Frederick shouted. "The purple bird has bitten Tutor Ink to death." "Oh, father dear, mother dear," cried Fanchon, "Tutor Ink is not Tutor Ink at all. He is really the wicked Mouche, king of the gnomes, a monstrous fly, but a fly with clothes and shoes and stockings on." "Who on earth has been putting such nonsense into your heads?" asked the Countess. And the parents gazed at the children in utter amazement while they went to tell about the stranger child whose mother was a great fairy queen, and about the gnome king Mouche and the purple bird. The Count grew very grave and thoughtful. "Frederick," said he, "you are really a sensible boy, and I must admit that Tutor Ink has always seemed to me a strange, mysterious creature. Your mother and I are by no means satisfied with him, particularly your mother. He has such a terrible sweet tooth. and there is no way of keeping him from the sugar and jams. And then he hums and buzzes in such a distressing manner. But in spite of all this, my dear boy, just think calmly for a minute. Even if there are such things as gnomes in the world, do you really mean to say that your tutor has become a fly?" Frederick looked his father steadily in the face with his clear blue eyes, and said, "I should not have believed it myself if the stranger child had not said so, and if I had not seen it with my own eyes that he is only a horrible fly and pretends to be Tutor Ink. And then," continued Frederick, while his father shook his head in wonder, "see what mother says about him. Is he not ravenous for sweet things? Is that not just like a fly? And then his hummings and buzzings—" "Silence!" cried the Count. "Whatever Tutor Ink is, one thing is certain. The purple bird has not bitten him to death, for there he comes out of the wood." At this the children uttered loud screams and rushed behind the door. In truth, Tutor Ink was approaching. But he was wild-looking and bewildered. He was buzzing and humming and springing high in the air, first to one side, then to the other, banging his head against the trees. He tumbled into the house and dashed at the milk jug and popped his head into it so that the milk ran over the sides. Then he gulped and gulped, making a horrid noise of swallowing. "What ails you, Tutor Ink?" cried the Countess. "What are you about?" "Are you out of your senses?" asked the Count. "Is the foul fiend after you?" But without making any answer, Tutor Ink, taking his mouth from the milk jug, threw himself down on the dish of butter and began to lick it with his pointed tongue. And then with a loud buzzing he sprang off the table and began to stagger hither and thither about the room as though he were drunk. "This is a pretty behaviour," cried the Count, as he tried to seize Tutor Ink by the coat-tails, but Tutor Ink managed to elude him deftly. Just then Frederick came running up with his father's big fly flapper in his hand, and gave it to the Count, crying, "Here you are, father! Knock the terrible Mouche to death!" The Count took the fly flapper, and then they all set to work to drive away Tutor Ink. Fanchon and Frederick and their mother took table napkins and made sweeps with them in the air, driving the tutor backward and forward, here and there, while the Count kept striking at him with the fly flapper. Wilder and wilder grew the chase. Hum, hum, and sum, sum went the tutor, storming hither and thither. Flip, flap, and clip, clap went the table napkins and fly flapper. At last the Count managed to hit the tutor's coat-tails. Then, just as the Count was going to strike a second time, up bounced the tutor into the air, and with renewed strength stormed, humming and buzzing, out of the door and away among the trees. "Well done!" exclaimed the Count. "We are rid of that abominable Tutor Ink. Never shall he cross my threshold again." How the naughty playthings became alive. Fanchon and Frederick now breathed freely once more. A great weight was taken off their hearts. They rejoiced that now, since the wicked Mouche was gone, the stranger child might come back. They hurried to the wood. Everything was silent and deserted. Not a merry note of a single bird was there. Instead of the joyous singing of the brook and the gladsome rustling of the leaves, they seemed to hear sighs and moans that passed through the air. Just then, close behind them, snarling voices cried out, "Stupid creatures! Senseless creatures! You despised us! You did not know how to treat us! We are come back to punish you!" Fanchon and Frederick looked around, and saw the little hunter and the harper rise out of the thicket. The harper twanged his tiny harp, while the hunter took aim at Frederick, and both cried out, "Wait, you boy and girl! We are obedient servants of Tutor Ink. He will be here in a minute, and then we'll pay you well for despising us." Terrified, the children turned to run away, when the doll rose up out of the thicket and squeaked out, "Stupid creatures! Senseless creatures! I am an obedient servant of Tutor Ink. He will be here in a moment, and then I'll pay you well for despising me." And with that the naughty creatures sent great splashes of muddy water flying at Fanchon and Frederick, so that they were quite wet. Then the children fell on their knees, sobbing, "Oh, how unfortunate we are! Will no one take pity on us?" Scarcely had they said thus, when the playthings disappeared. The rushing of the brook turned to the sweetest music. All the wood streamed with a wonderful sparkling light, and lo, the stranger child came forth from the thicket, surrounded by such brilliant rays that Fanchon and Frederic had to shut their eyes for a minute. Then they felt themselves touched gently, and the stranger child's sweet voice said, "Oh, do not mourn for me, dear playmates, though you will not see me again. Still I shall be near you. Neither the wicked Mouche nor any other gnome shall have power to harm you. Only go on loving me faithfully." That we shall, dear shining child," the children cried. "We love you with all our hearts." And at last, when they could open their eyes, the stranger child had vanished, and all their grief and fear were gone too. Delight beamed in their eyes and shone in their cheeks. And what the stranger child had said came to pass. Nothing ever harmed Fanchon and Frederic. They grew up handsome, clever, and sweet-tempered, and all that they undertook prospered. And as the years went on, they still, in their dreams, played with the stranger child, who never ceased to bring them the loveliest things from its fairy home. End of Chapter 73. Recording by Thomas Rose.
Chapter 74 of the Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nemo. The Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud by Francis Jenkins OLCOTT. Mabel on Midsummer Day. A Story of the Olden Time, Part 1. "Arise, my maiden Mabel," the mother said, "arise, for the golden sun of midsummer is shining in the skies. Arise, my little maiden, for thou must speed away to wait upon thy grandmother this livelong summer day. And thou must carry with thee this wheaten cake so fine, this new-made pat of butter, this little flask of wine. And tell the dear old body, this day I cannot come, for the good man went out yestermorn, and he is not come home. And more than this, poor Amy upon my knee doth lie. I fear me, with this fever pain, the little child will die. And thou canst help thy grandmother, the table thou canst spread, canst feed the little dog and bird, and thou canst make her bed. And thou canst fetch the water from the lady well hard by, and thou canst gather from the wood the faggots brown and dry. Canst go down to the lonesome glen to milk the mother ewe. This is the work, my Mabel, that thou wilt have to do. But listen now, my Mabel, this is Midsummer Day, when all the fairy people from Elfland come away. And when thou'rt in the lonesome glen, keep by the running burn, and do not pluck the strawberry flower, nor break the lady fern. But think not of the fairy folk, lest mischief should befall. Think only of poor Amy, and how thou lovest us all. Yet keep good heart, my Mabel, if thou the fairies see, and give them kindly answer, if they should speak to thee. And when into the fir wood thou goest for faggots brown, do not, like idle children, go wandering up and down. But fill thy little apron, my child, with earnest speed, and that thou break no living bough within the wood take heed. For they are spiteful brownies who in the wood abide, so be thou careful of this thing, lest evil should betide. But think not, little Mabel, whilst thou art in the wood, of dwarfish, wilful brownies, but of the Father good. And when thou goest to the spring to fetch the water thence, do not disturb the little stream, lest this should give offence. For the Queen of all the fairies, she loves that water bright, I've seen her drinking there myself on many a summer night. But she's a gracious lady, and her thou needst not fear, only disturb thou not the stream, nor spill the water clear. Now all this I will heed, mother, will no word disobey, and wait upon the grandmother this livelong summer day. Part 2. Away tripped little Mabel with a wheaten cake so fine, with the new made pat of butter and the little flask of wine. And long before the sun was hot and the summer mist had cleared, beside the good old grandmother the willing child appeared. In all her mother's message she told with right good will how that the father was away and the little child was ill. And then she swept the hearth up clean, and then the table spread, and next she fed the dog and bird, and then she made the bed. And go now, said the grandmother, 10 paces down the dell, and bring in water for the day, thou know'st the lady well. The first time that good Mabel went, nothing at all saw she, except a bird, a sky blue bird, that sat upon a tree. The next time that good Mabel went, there sat a lady bright, beside the well, a lady small, all clothed in green and white. A curtsy low made Mabel, and then she stooped to fill her pitcher at the sparkling spring, but no drop did she spill. Thou art a handy maiden, the fairy lady said, thou hast not spilled a drop nor yet the fairy spring troubled. And for this thing which thou hast done, yet mayst not understand, I give to thee a better gift than houses or than land. Thou shalt do well, whate'er thou dost, as thou hast done this day, shalt have the will and power to please, and shalt be loved alway. Thus having said, she passed from sight, and naught could Mabel see, but the little bird, the sky blue bird, upon the leafy tree. Part 3. And now go, said the grandmother, and fetch in faggots dry, all in the neighbouring firwood, beneath the trees they lie. Away went kind good Mabel into the firwood near, where all the ground was dry and brown, and the grass grew thin and sere. She did not wander up and down, nor yet a live branch pull, but steadily of the fallen boughs she picked her apron full. And when the wildwood brownies came sliding to her mind, she drove them thence, as she was told, with home thoughts sweet and kind. But all that while the brownies within the firwood still, they watched her how she picked the wood, and strove to do no ill. And oh, but she is small and neat, said one, 'twere shame to spite a creature so demure and meek, a creature harmless quite. Look only, said another, at her little gown of blue, at her kerchief pinned about her head, and at her little shoe. Oh, but she is a comely child, said a third, and we will lay a good luck penny in her path, a boon for her this day, seeing she broke no living wood, no live thing did affray. With that the smallest penny of the finest silver ore, upon the dry and slippery path lay Mabel's feet before. With joy she picked the penny up, the fairy penny good, and with her faggots dry and brown went wandering from the wood. Now she has that, said the brownies, let flax be ever so dear, 'twill buy her clothes of the very best for many and many a year. Part 4. And go now, said the grandmother, since falling is the dew, go down unto the lonesome glen, and milk the mother ewe. All down into the lonesome glen, through copses thick and wild, through moist rank grass by trickling streams, went on the willing child. And when she came to the lonesome glen, she kept beside the burn, and neither plucked the strawberry flower, nor broke the lady fern. And while she milked the mother ewe within this lonesome glen, she wished that little Amy were strong and well again. And soon as she had thought this thought, she heard a coming sound, as if 1,000 fairy folk were gathering all around. And then she heard a little voice, shrill as the midge's wing, that spake aloud, a human child is here, yet mark this thing. The lady fern is all unbroke, the strawberry flower unto end. What shall be done for her who still from mischief can refrain? Give her a fairy cake, said one. Grant her a wish, said three. The latest wish that she hath wished, said all, whate'er it be. Kind Mabel heard the words they spake, and from the lonesome glen unto the good old grandmother went gladly back again. Thus happened it to Mabel on that midsummer day, and these three fairy blessings she took with her away. 'Tis good to make all duty sweet, to be alert and kind. 'Tis good, like little Mabel, to have a willing mind. Mary Howitt. End of Mabel on Midsummer Day. Chapter 75 of the Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nemo. The Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud by Francis Jenkins OLCOTT. Oh, where do the fairies hide their heads? Oh, where do fairies hide their heads when snow lies on the hills, when frost has spoiled their mossy beds and crystallized their rills? Beneath the moon they cannot trip in circles o'er the plain, in draughts of dew they cannot sip till green leaves come again. When they return there will be mirth and music in the air, and fairy wings upon the earth, and mischief everywhere. The maids, to keep the elves aloof, will bar the doors in vain. No keyhole will be fairy proof when green leaves come again. Thomas Haynes Bailey. End of Oh, Where Do Fairies Hide Their Heads? Chapter 76 of the Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nemo. The Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud by Francis Jenkins OLCOTT. The Fairies Passage. 1. Tap, 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 rap. Get up, Gaffer Fairyman. Ah, who is there? The clock strikes 3. Get up, do Gaffer. You are the very man we have been longing to see. The ferryman rises, growling and grumbling, and goes fumbling and stumbling and tumbling over the wares in his way to the door. But he sees no more than he saw before, till a voice is heard. "Oh, ferryman dear, here we are waiting, all of us here. We are a wee colony, we, some 200 in all, or 3. Ferry us over the river Lee ere dawn of day, and we will pay the most we may, in our own wee way." 2. Who are you? Whence came you? What place are you going to? Oh, we have dwelt overlong in this land. The people get cross, and are growing so knowing too. Nothing at all but they now understand. We are daily vanishing under the thunder of some huge engine or iron wonder. That iron, ah, it has entered our souls. Your souls? Oh, goals, you queer little drolls. Do you mean? Good Gaffer, do aid us with speed, for our time like our stature is short indeed, and a very long way we have to go, 8 or 10,000 miles or so, hither and thither, and to and fro, with our pots and pans and little gold cans, but our light caravans run swifter than man's. 3. Well, you may come," said the ferryman affably. "Patrick, turn out, and get ready the barge." Then again to the little folk, "Though you seem laughably small, I don't mind if your coppers be large. Oh dear, what a rushing, what pushing, what crushing! The watermen making vain efforts at hushing the hubbub the while. There followed these words: what clapping of boards, what strapping of cords, what stowing away of children and wives, and platters and mugs and spoons and knives, till all had safely got into the boat, and the ferryman, clad in his tip-top coat, and his wee little fairies were safely afloat. Then ding, 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 and cling, 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 how the coppers did ring in the tin pitcherling. 4. Off then went the boat, at first very pleasantly, smoothly and so forth, but after a while it swayed and it swaggered this and that way, and presently chest after chest and pile after pile of the little folks' goods began tossing and rolling and pitching like fun beyond fairy controlling. Oh, Mab, if the hubbub were great before, it was now some 2 or 3 million times more. Crash went the wee crocks, and the clocks and the locks of each little wee box were strove in by hard knocks. And then there were oaths and prayers and cries. Take care! See there! Oh dear, my eyes! I am killed! I am drowned! With groans and sighs. To land they drew, Yeo ho, pull to, tiller rope through and through, and all rights anew. 5. Now jump upon shore, ye queer little oddities. What is this? Where are they at all? Where are they, and where are their tiny commodities? Well, as I live, he looks blank as a wall. Poor ferryman, round him and round him he gazes, but only gets deeplier lost in the mazes of utter bewilderment. All are gone, and he stands alone, like a statue of stone. In a doldrum of wonder he turns to steer, and a tinkling laugh salutes his ear, with other odd sounds. Ha 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 ha! Fol lol, zid ziddle, qui ba ba! Fizzigiggiddy, fee see sha sha! O ye rascally thieves! The good man cries. He turns to his pitcher, and there, alas, to his horror perceives that the little folks' mode of making him richer has been to pay him with withered leaves. James Clarence Magan. End of The Fairies Passage. Chapter 77 of the Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Nemo. The Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud by Francis Jenkins OLCOTT. Old Winter's Fairyland. To Winter. Sooth 'tis, old friend, thou banishest the golden rest of the hours, dost cruelly send the birds off, and the twinkling band of the flowers, dost lash the shadows out of the woods, and kill the souls in the plunging floods. Thou chillest the green, and it departs into the hearts of the meas, and dreams of sheen, grasses and leaves, blossoms and sheaves, and of trees. Thou foldest all colors up in mold, and touchest the aching light of cold. There is no gloom of vanished wold, inlaid with gold, but glens and heights in bloom, and shadowing woods, and tumbling floods, and plains of summer in the core of the world, and golden skies are there unfurled. The fairies keep a revel there, and banish care with mirth, when snows are deep and woods are cross, and joy our loss in the earth. The leaves and grass and water springs, the glorious world with its living things, each happy thought that goes on wings, and sings, or thinks itself in blossomings, of red and gold, all bless the cold, that ruleth with an iron hand, to build in the earth a fairyland. At Christmas tide, on country farms, in games and charms thou thrivest. By deep hearth side, when tales are told and songs are trolled, as through the mold thou drivest the shuddering flowers, thou dost begin to gather us up and drive us in. For all whom care or labor drew from old to new in the year, thou dost prepare the roaring hearth, and garrulous mirth and beer and massy cans to season it, nut brown and livelier than thy wit. The Yule log sends its light abroad, o'er roof and board, and cheerily in shade ascends the cricket's song. The winds are strong, and drearily shrill past the rattling window panes, and down the wide-mouthed chimneys shriek and moan. The hind drops in from fold and pen, and graver men from labours, and maids who spin and catch perchance with smiling glance their neighbours. The dame is there and reverend sire, and children clustering round the fire. They quaff their ale, their pipes they fill, and he who has skill in numbers prolongs the tale. The wheel goes round with a drowsy sound and slumbers. The humming stoop goes round and round till their heads go round as the wheel goes round, and sleep and silence go their round, and the fairies' summer underground blooms all night long in sleep till morning, buds and blossoms without a sound. Anonymous. End of Old Winter's Fairyland. End of The Book of Elves and Fairies for Storytelling and Reading Aloud by Frances Jenkins OLCOTT.